Sorry, it's a tired computer. I think I've been working pretty hard. Personally speaking, I have sort of no crypto investments to date. Over the last year, I've spent a lot of time looking at blockchain business models. And basically, my background has really been around how do you figure out value when you have some disruptive sort of technologies, right? And how do you sort of design a system where you can build something extremely valuable? So, no. Perfect. All right. Hopefully this works. Okay, great. So, like I said, I can really consider myself sort of a student of disruptive innovation. I've also, over the last year, I've been wearing a couple of different hats. One of them being entrepreneur in residence at Harvard. So I was basically working with a lot of labs across engineering, trying to help professors and faculty and postdocs think about commercializing their work. And the other sort of my day job really was looking and helping out this little company called Zemcar, which was thinking about rideshare a little differently than sort of how we've experienced with Uber and Lyft and some of these other companies. So it's hard to get away from what's happening in the press, right? So it seems like almost every kind, the whole spectrum of media is covered with blockchain news, right? All the way from sort of Harvard Business Review to sort of technical publications as well. And what I feel is like we've come a long way from 2009, 2010, when this was a sort of on the fringes, right? And now we basically I think the last year was when for the first time there was a large-scale recognition that this is something more foundational. So this is an interesting excerpt from Harvard Business Review last year, where they were basically comparing Bitcoin as the killer application for blockchain. And I think it's only been sort of a year, and I think at least my perspective is a little different, and I'll kind of share a little bit more. So I do think that we're in a foundational shift, right? And what I mean is that every time there's a foundational shift in technologies, it's very, very hard to predict how this will evolve. And so basically what I kind of look at my inspiration is like what happened with the internet. It was about 1983 when ARPANET came out, and it took about 7 years before Tim Berners-Lee came up with his World Wide Web. And it was extremely hard at that point to really figure out downstream implications for various business models. One of them being this incredibly wide sort of connected world of fiber cables. And right, so one of the other things that we saw was like, how did the telecom industry really respond? It evolved, made incredible amount of investments on the back end, and that was sort of the initial focus, right? It was really around creating these massive pipes where you could create amazing experiences that we sort of take for granted today. Out came sort of Google shortly thereafter when internet was in the early stages. And now for the first few applications, it was all around search, but you can see all the things that Google is doing today. It's about connecting the world, but it's also about sort of figuring out the insights. Again, application further downstream. We had Facebook about 5 years after Google was founded. And this is perhaps the most interesting story, right? This is the world that we live in. So about 15 years later, we see all of those amazing technologies converging in this little box that sits in our homes, where we have multiple technologies sort of coming together. And this is an interesting quote, again, right? So just in terms of how people look at technologies and look at sort of where we are today, I find this very insightful in terms of just how industries and markets have transformed because of technology, right? So you have some of the biggest media companies without really creating content. You have Airbnbs, which have probably 5x the value of Marriott today. without having their own properties. So you see a fundamental shift basically on how value is not only created, but also delivered. And that's kind of where my personal thesis is, right? So I've spent the last year working in sort of bleeding edge technologies, including blockchain. And my personal thesis is like, I think there's something more foundational happening, which has happened before, right? So we certainly have a blueprint of things that are kind of similar. And it really, I think there certainly is some pattern recognition that we can look back here at. So every time there is this sort of foundational shift, what I did was basically broke it down into 2 or 3 big buckets, right? So you get this first wave of investments into infrastructure, and then you have these sort of bolt-on applications that I would call them. You take an existing business model, you take a certain new technology and try and deliver and capture value around that. So this is actually equity research, excerpt from an equity research report from Credit Suisse a few months back, which basically maps out all the different investments and the different buckets that are emerging around blockchain. And you'll see most of these things tend to be sort of focused on infrastructure right now, which is understandable because once the infrastructure piece is in place, we're going to see the second layer of applications kick in, and then I think things get very interesting. So I think we've all kind of, probably most of you have seen what's happening in the ICO world. There's a lot of money that was raised last year. There are a lot of questions around credibility of certain companies, but I think it's very, very clear that there is some massive opportunity around not only how people think about financing, but also fundamental shift around delivery of value in different industries. So this is a question that I started with, right? So why is it so interesting? Why is there so much interest around blockchain? There was actually a paper about six years ago by the UK government where they outlined blockchain as one of the 10 most transformative technologies over the next decade. And I think it's in line with this notion of this, I think somebody said, every business or blockchain is basically used for transaction. And I think that's true. Every business sort of has some level of these transactions built in. But if you really want to break it down, what is the primary value? I would argue it's around those 3 buckets, right? Those 4 buckets. It's basically you can digitize a certain asset, you can decentralize it, so there's no need for a central trust agency, and it's incredibly secure. So you almost have a perfect mechanism to exchange value. And this is where the ICO market is super interesting because the technology as well as the community has somehow figured out how to pay for some of this innovation. And I think it's an interesting opportunity, certainly for people who are trying to start ventures in this space. So I kind of touched up on these 3 key themes, right? So I think it's still very early in the game. A lot of focus is just on building the basic infrastructure. And I think the way I look at this is once some of those pieces are in place, we're going to start seeing new connections emerge around different markets, around different experiences. And that's where you get sort of exponential opportunity to create value. So like I said, this is sort of a lot of my study over the last year has been around, how do we, it's not just about putting some of these building blocks in place, but how does the consumer experience evolve over the next 3 to 5 years around these massive markets? So you're talking about healthcare, you're talking about transportation, you're talking about banking. These are foundational sort of markets for any society. And so personally speaking, I spend a lot of time thinking about these three pieces. Perhaps I can leave you guys with a little bit of a synthesis, right? So as I think about what are the different parts of disruption for blockchain, I would create those sort of, that's sort of the laundry list. If I look at the strategic value, I would look at sort of things like disintermediation, where you really don't need a central agency to provide that trust factor. And I think HBR had it right. Fintech is really sort of the heart of this, but it's going to have long-term implications for a whole bunch of other industries. And actually, one thing that I find incredibly interesting is there's perhaps a new value system that blockchain is kind of pushing us towards, right? How do we think about data sharing? How do we think about privacy? And how do we think about the value that some of these companies are able to capture on our behalf? And how do I think about sort of that value being shared, not just for a better experience, but some monetary gain as well? So I think there's some interesting controls that blockchain can bring to the table. So, this is a little bit of a summary of some of the things that I've personally been looking into over the last 6 months. How does blockchain really, looking at, let's say, transportation as a market, we're using Uber, we're using Lyft, ownership is changing, our sense of how we think about ownership of cars. People simply don't prefer not to have cars at this point. And so how do car companies really think about this? And so one of the things that I think is super interesting is, if you fast forward 5 years, 7 years from now, I think we're going to all be living in a place where car ownership is going to be probably a minority of the overall market share. It's largely going to be based on a service model. And we're going to see certain technologies emerge which will give us this dynamic ability to not only capture value, but deliver value as a company. And so what I mean is you could potentially have a system which is based on trust, right? So you can basically code some of these things into how your decentralized organizations work. What really do you value as a network? And I think some of those things can be super interesting, especially when you look at transportation, smart city movements, and looking at supply chain in transportation is another big one. We think that there is a considerable opportunity there to bring some of these things onto blockchain, both on the front end and on the back end. And I think it's around restructuring incentives for the supply chain in transportation, which is super interesting. So I'm sure you've seen this kind of graphs before, right? This is a Gartner hype cycle, and I've kind of outlined where they think blockchain is today. And I think they're largely right, I would say. We've gone through a huge hype cycle last year. It's more around foundational opportunities at this point, infrastructure investments. But I do think that there is, it's very, very early. I also think that there are not enough people really understand downstream implications that a lot of these technologies really converge. And so when you think about AI, when you think about decentralized organizations where members of that network really design and decide how the economics work, I mean, that's a fundamentally new, different way of thinking about the world. And this is kind of where I feel like the world is today, right? We're in the early stages of people where you're trying to build the next one, and I think there's a lot of money in the blockchain world. But there's a lot of people who are doing scrappy work, who are thinking long term, who are real, and I prefer to sort of focus on that. So those are all my prepared sort of comments, but I'm happy to take questions.
Are you familiar with CryptoKitties?
Yeah, a little bit.
So I have a question around monetizing these decentralized applications.
Yeah.
So CryptoKitties is essentially, the website is just an interface that reads off of the public blockchain. But theoretically, I could write something that just reads off the Ethereum blockchain and make my own CryptoKitty game using their same smart contract. So how would CryptoKitties company profit or monetize the application they built?
So perhaps I can answer that question in a slightly different way, right? I think how would any company try and monetize blockchain or a platform that's largely costless, where the value is around being a frictionless network, where you are, and I think the answer really is thinking about economics differently, right? You can't really take, let's say if you're taking transportation as an example, the traditional model that Uber and Lyft have been working on is, there's a 75-25% revenue share split. I think if you are doing anything around blockchain, you want to be able to incentivize and realign some of those things. So perhaps there is a 100% pass through to the driver. Perhaps there are other ways on how you can monetize consumer data and driver data and a lot of that traffic movements. So I think it's about thinking about economics differently, not trying to front load everything. And the other big one is really around network effects. So some of the biggest companies in the world have been built on that. And if you can find real value that you can connect with upfront, I think you'll figure out how to make money is a reasonable strategy. Right? Yeah.
Could you comment on the blockchain used in healthcare a little bit? Because it presents its own unique challenges with the fact that there's so many disconnected systems within healthcare.
Right.
And the privacy and security issues behind it, and also the incentivization of these systems using it.
Yeah. So in my first two startups were in healthcare, adjacently, right? So one was a medical device, one was a consumer health company. And I'm intimately familiar with the regulatory environment and sort of the constraints sometimes that puts on ventures. And so it's a huge burden, but at the same time, there is a function that it serves, right? So I guess to your question, there's already a bunch of different companies who are taking blockchain applications and either doing a bolt-on or it's like, we're doing health records now and putting it on smart contracts. And I think those kinds of, I almost call them knee-jerk reactions, right? So where you find a tool and you're going to sort of find the sort of the nail, right? You could go and sort of, I think that's the very obvious application in healthcare. I think data and data security is a big one, as you can, obviously. So HIPAA compliance, all of those things, those are the very obvious applications. I think other than that, I would say it's eventually going to come to when you have convergence of multiple applications, particularly AI, around, and see, blockchain itself is an enabling technology, right? So I think the way I think about this is you have to wait and see for this next wave of sort of things that are getting kind of pushing the boundary of what's possible, right? So distributed ledger, there's all sorts of buzzwords. So I've tried to avoid using buzzwords today. But the idea is like, I think there are definitely interesting applications when you merge multiple core technologies, including AI. So I would say it's a little early to kind of think of downstream stuff, but the obvious one is certainly EMR and things like that. And that's already, there's a bunch of companies who've raised a lot of money in ICOs already to solve that. So, yeah. So that's a really good question. Again, like I said, I'm not a blockchain or technology expert here, but it's more of a student of what's happening overall in the market, right? I've certainly seen a bunch of startups trying to, you know, either fork blockchain in interesting ways. There's actually an MIT spin out called Algorand, which one of the core value propositions for them is that it's very energy efficient. I think you will begin to see some of these discussions become more mainstream. There's a lot of stuff in the press about this. There may be some interesting hardware, certainly there's a side of hardware piece which I think folks are trying to resolve. And there's perhaps a third piece which is around just smart grids and how do you do it in a more efficient way perhaps, or have incentives in certain countries, right? So literally nation states are kind of stepping up and saying we'll underwrite this or we'll give you discounts just because they want to incentivize this industry to emerge. And so I think there are different flavors of this. And it's kind of early in terms of will there be one dominant sort of application to solve that problem. Yeah, back there. Sorry.
Thank you for the speech. When we talk about blockchain, we usually connect it with Bitcoin. And recently, as I know, Google, Twitter, Facebook, they banned the advertisement of cryptocurrency. I wonder what's your take on this and also how to put the Bitcoin with lowercase b into blockchain. Thank you.
Did you say video currency? What was Google doing?
Cryptocurrency.
Oh, cryptocurrency. So could you please repeat that question? I'm not sure I got the gist of it.
Sure. So when we talk about blockchain, we usually will connect it with Bitcoin,
Sure.
right? But currently, Google and some other big advertisement companies, they ban the cryptocurrency or the Bitcoin advertisement.
Oh, yes.
And then, so my question is, what's your take on this?
Yes.
And also, how to put the Bitcoin, which with a lowercase b of the cryptocurrency into the blockchain? What will be a good way to do that?
So I certainly have an opinion on the first one. I think in a way it's a good thing in the interim because there's an incredible amount of irrational exuberance, and a lot of those ads are targeted to people who not necessarily understand what's behind that. So I think certainly for people who are serious about building companies, I would look at that as a positive, because you will always find institutional money if you have a good team. The fundamentals of starting a venture are not different, around blockchain. Fundamentals are the same. You need an awesome team. You need a big idea. You need to be solving a real problem. And I think if you go down that checklist, then you shouldn't really worry about, like, nobody really raises money on AdWords, right? Like, you don't, like, if you're starting a venture, that's not the first thing that you think about. And I think again, if you're a serious team and you want to do something, then it should be a non-issue. So that's kind of how I feel about that. Yep. Sorry, I'll take you next.
What you touched on about the car shift in the way that we think about vehicles, have you thought about houses and whether people will be in another shift in that your home will become something that is something that you might shift to? I'm just interested in that angle of the blockchain.
Super interesting question, and I think it goes to all asset bases, all asset classes, right? So it's not just a question about, how we think about ownership for cars, moving to, shared ownership or community ownership, or just look at the amount of space we waste in parking. Like 2/3 of the roads are used for parking. Right? And it's an incredibly inefficient way of how cities invest in infrastructure. So That's just so I think, yes, I would say that's a very interesting potential market application. It's taking any asset, and if you can create efficiency around the transaction, and you can create sort of, you basically are creating a network which is based on trust inherently, right? And if you use that trust as a mechanism of how people within that network are kind of scored, I think it gradually sort of, it has certain behavior modification models baked into it where you're gonna have a lot of efficiency and value. So I think that's a fantastic market to look at. Yeah.
So I have two questions. So one big Wall Street analyst said Bitcoin might reach 250K in 2022. So he said Bitcoin might reach 250K, 250K, yeah, in 2022. And I don't think, what do you think about it? And then, do you think cryptocurrency is here to stay, or is just going to go away? Or people should just invest in it and just keep it as being some type of legacy money, should give it back to your great grandchildren or something?
So I have no idea. The first question is like, I think, again, I'm not an expert on crypto, but I think, I mean, those kind of predictions are actually quite useless, right? Because if you look at any technology, look at the sort of the core principles. Go down to sort of your, where is the value? How is the value delivered? How is the value captured? How is it going to transform people's lives? Go to first principles, right? And like when you're starting any business, you should look at sort of first principles. And so I would look at that and say, is crypto solving a real problem? Absolutely yes. The short answer is yes. Because if you look at the rest of the world, there's a lot of people who could use this costless transaction, sort of frictionless access to money. Now, there's a lot of questionable activities around crypto today, but I think that's going to hopefully get flushed out as things mature and the regulatory side matures as well. So, to go next, yeah.
I want to know what you think about the token model when you look at the blockchain startups. If it's just simply replace the fiats, or it has to be, have some kind of like deep token model which fiat cannot be achieved. And this is my first question. The second question is, what do you think about Lightning Network, Zcash, or Nano, and all this kind of like alternative to the Bitcoins as a payments?
Yeah.
Who's gonna be the first runners? Who's gonna be the survivor for the, maybe for the
All
next
right,
few
great.
years?
A lot of interest in crypto. So I would say I really have no clue who's going to be last. Sort of, I think it's fundamentally about network having confidence in some of these things, right? So like if you look at the first principles, is like do enough people believe that there's inherent value in Bitcoin, and as long as that continues to grow, and there are some natural incentives for that. People who hold obviously are bought into that idea. So I think, like I said, this is my conclusion around sort of blockchain is like it's very foundational, right? So Bitcoin, crypto, all of these things. And I think if you look at what happened with sort of the dot-coms, right? There was anybody who had a reasonably sort of crazy idea could raise tens of millions sort of at that point. And so I think there's a lot of analogies here where there's a irrational exuberance. People are raising money through ICOs, don't have a team, don't have an idea that's even baked. And so I think it's really up to investors or the market to kind of sift that through. And I think some of that correction has happened already, or some of it. But I'm fairly long on the foundational piece, right? So I think there's a real problem that the technology solves. I think digital assets are going to continue to get digitized, right? And I think blockchain itself is just one piece. So the way I look at this is it's like the Pandora's box, right? So somebody's opened and shown how this is done. Now there are going to be a million flavors of this. And so and one of those applications is going to become fairly dominant. And that's how I see it. There's a question.
Oh,
here.
we have to wrap up for the panel.
Okay. All right, thank you. Well, I'll be outside.
Thank you.